Hi, this is Dr. John Grazel, Baha'i Chair for World Peace, and this is one of our synoptic, short case studies on international development. In this case, looking at the USSR and Russia together. Russia, now one of what's called the four BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that in another video I discuss how they're changing the realities of international development, often put together, but really very, very different. And now, quickly, to understand Russia's role, it really begins with international development because the Marshall Plan came out of Russia's actual refusal to participate. They themselves, therefore, came forward with their own alternative in the Cold War and tried to do foreign assistance of their own. They mainly did things like dams, the most famous being the Aswan Dam, stadiums, the type of statues, the sort of thing that projected Soviet presence and purported friendship. But in fact, research we did, when you look into the history, what was really interesting is you find out that after a short period of time, actually most countries didn't need much from Russia. They would send some students to Russian universities. They would get some medical training. But in fact, Russia, in many cases, needed more than other countries of goods. For instance, the Russians needed Egyptian cotton. The Russians actually needed manufactured goods out of India. And in reality, it turned out that the main thing that the Russians had to give in return were arms. And therefore, their arms and their political support to certain regimes were, in the end, a majority of their foreign assistance. The exception being in the case of real subsidies of certain countries' economies. Two outstanding cases being Cuba and Mongolia, both countries that basically built themselves up, provided services to their citizens, very much on subsidies from the USSR because they were considered of great political importance. And which collapsed with the USSR, and those subsidies disappeared instantaneously when the USSR came apart. Now, when the USSR came apart, Russia itself, along with the other members of the USSR, in many cases suddenly transformed from purported providers of international assistance to actual recipients of international assistance. And the United States actually established a USAID mission. World Bank people came in giving money to Russia. What did they give money to Russia for? Well, it was sort of things, but more than anything else, it was for a combination of governmental and market reform. And the market reform took the form of shock therapy, which we discussed in another video, along with structural adjustment. Both theories that said basically make extremely rapid conversions from communist economies to modern capitalist market economies, and the society will adjust around it. And the democratic reform were very much in terms of promotion of civil society groups as a new form of political expression. In fact, however, what happened was that particularly the shock therapy, which resulted in the privatization of Russian industry, didn't come with any sort of systematic reform of Russia itself. No systematic legal reform, no larger Marshall Plan that really brought people together in a very well formulated cooperative venture. And the result was, yes, there was massive privatization. There also was massive collapse, economic collapse, a tremendous increase in poverty, tremendous decrease in public services such as health and education, and basically a conversion from a communist party system to what has often been called the Russian mafia, a system where a small number of people basically grab hold and privatize for themselves the economic goods of the former Soviet Union, and resulted as today as Moscow being the city that's very often called the city with the most billionaires in the world. This was definitely a push strategy, and it was particularly advanced by the Harvard Institute for International Development, which was directed by Jeffrey Sachs. They themselves do not accept a lot of the criticism, much for the corruption that came out of it. Interestingly enough, however, the Harvard Institute for International Development itself was dissolved in the year 2000 because precisely of a scandal where several of its members and spouses of its members actually were accused of trading Russian government bonds and using development-funded activities for their own private enrichment. In that way, corruption is a very sticky substance. And more than anything else, there was an enormous loss of the tremendous education, particularly science capacity, that existed in the USSR. There had been proposals by the National Science Foundation and others to help Russia really become a modern industrial economy. That was not accepted. Why? Some people said money. Some people said, in fact, people didn't want Russia to be that powerful. Some said they just, because of the hostilities of the Cold War, it couldn't be pulled off. But the fact is that in the end, what we had in Russia was now is a development of a powerful, resource-dependent economy run by a rather corrupt oligarchy, what seems to be an ever-diminishing understanding of democracy, definite decreases in quality of life. Life expectancy has actually continuously been going down in Russia. Russia is actually its population is decreasing in size. Education has gone down in quality. And in fact, except for the large number of millionaires and the fact that Russia is no longer a military and strategic threat to the West, one could make a good case that international development that's provided for Russia at best was a modest success. And in fact, I think in the end, I would say that when we look at Russia, the real problem is it converted from a system that wasn't the Western system, but had a foundational set of principles in communism, to a system that had actually no foundational principles. And today, it is basically trying to recreate itself on little more than the fact that it is a rich resource country and wishing to garner the wealth of that for the group that controls it. And in this way, I think one can really look upon Russia as possibly one of the greatest failures of opportunity in the history of international development. Whether you really could have converted Russia like the Marshall Plan converted Europe, one can never know. But certainly, if you could take a Nazi Germany and turn it into a democratic Germany in a few years, it probably was worth the try. But the try was never really given. The formula was never really used. Systematic, cooperative, sustainable, equitable development. What basically was that foreign assistance was provided in order to convert Russia out of being a communist country into being an acceptable country for a capitalist world. And today, the result is that Russia mimics that type of nation, but really has trouble playing its role. One of the things it is doing is establishing its own international development program. It's actually looked around and tried to model it, but because it really doesn't have any foundational principles, it's basically bought onto the Millennium Development Goals in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of education. Yet it itself used to have much higher levels of public services in terms of education, health, and housing. But in terms of the phenomena of international development, this can not only be a condemnation of Russia, because we have to ask ourselves, what happened when during 40 plus years of international development that revolved around the Cold War and the communist versus the non-communist system, each claiming a superiority, moral, ethical, over the other, suddenly found that when the Cold War ended, the model of international development actually resulted in a decrease in the basic quality of life in countries of the former communist system, and that has not yet been compensated for under international development in the post-Cold War years.